My name is Isa Berry. My pronouns are she, her, and Emily, Ann, and I are really excited about doing this training with you all today. We're going to be talking about FEPS from the community. So what that means is we're going to be discussing cases for individuals who are seeking FEPS but already live in housing. We're not going to be discussing much FEPS from shelter. However, there are a lot of similarities where it comes to the rules regarding FEPS from shelter. So we're going to review 7 major elements of screening at intake so that you know whether or not your clients are actually eligible for FEPS. We're going to talk about why it's harder to move for FEPS. And then we're going to talk about some of the more specific rules that you need when settling a case if your client is in housing court or filling out the FEPS application. Also throughout, we're going to be talking about recent updates to the FEPS program, but there continue to be updates being made.
Hi, everyone. I want to echo Isatu's statements about welcoming us for being here. We're really happy to be with you all. My name is Emily Lundgren, and I am a staff attorney in the Brooklyn neighborhood office and I represent tenants in eviction cases, tenant defense cases. And so I'm going to be doing the first kind of portion of our training, talking to you about the first few rules and just giving kind of a basic overview of FEPS and what it is. So FEPS is a rent subsidy program, meaning that it's in addition to the shelter payments that individuals are getting, eligible applicants receive an ongoing rent subsidy to help them pay their rent. If the individual that you're working with is planning to stay in their apartment, FEPS can also be used to help cover arrears if there is back rent that's owed at the time. So the subsidy provides sort of a retroactive component if you're going to be staying in the same apartment, and a prospective component in that it's going to provide some sort of subsidy to the applicant, depending on their sources of income, will change how much that subsidy is. So there are 2 FEPS programs, FEPS A, which is an entitlement program, and FEPS B. FEPS A is, as you can sort of see from the little subheadings, is a much more common program. We, in our work at Legal Aid, deal exclusively with people who are applying for FEPS A. FEPS B, which we'll spend slightly less time on, well, actually almost no time on other than this slide, we're just going to give you a little quick overview, has a lot of the same eligibility requirements in terms of, or a lot of the same benefits, but has different eligibility requirements. So FEPS B is focused on families who are either trying to relocate generally because of they're dealing with issues related to domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and they either need to move or get out of a shelter that was based on that. And those can only be processed by home base. If they're staying in their apartment, they also need Family Justice Center approval, and only 25 applicants are approved. If that's something that you think might an individual that you're working with might be eligible for, I definitely recommend bringing it to the Ask a Lawyer training next week to talk about the specifics. That's probably a better opportunity. Turning our attention back to FEPS A. So there are 2 types of FEPS A programs. As Isatu mentioned, we're really going to be focusing today on FEPS A to stay instead of FEPS A to move. To stay applications, meaning staying in the current apartment, are going to help individuals pay both back rent and future rent. And in order to qualify, there are some basic eligibility rules that we're going to go over, and they can be processed by legal service providers. Those applications can be processed by legal service providers, by home-based locations, or by HRA. So there are a few different mechanisms that clients can go in. FEPS Move, just very briefly, is only for future rent, and it's trying to help people relocate from shelter into an apartment, or from their current apartment where they can't stay because it's not a viable option, to another apartment. So it's only helping with future rent to establish a new household, and those applications can only be processed by home base. So there are 7 major rules, or at least at legal aid, that's how we've tried to divide them to make it clear in terms of what you can be looking for. And so we're going to go through each rule individually, but this is kind of an overlook in terms of what's coming throughout the presentation. So the 7 rules are, this is the most important one, number 1, that the household needs to have a cash assistance case and a minor. And we'll get into the specifics of what that looks like, but both those 2 fundamental elements need to be met. The family also must be facing homelessness or already homeless. The family has to have at least a 1-year lease agreement to stay in the apartment, or the apartment needs to be rent regulated. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Everyone, almost everyone, has to pay a share. And if you're staying, the applicant should not owe, in the general times, no more than $9,000 in back rent. But for the current year, and notice the highlight, it can be up to $20,000 in back rent that's owed. That's sort of an exception that they've been making in this year based on the pandemic, largely. And if they have other resources, they need to use those resources to help pay the rent arrears. And the amount of the subsidy that they're going to get from FEPS is going to depend on a lot of factors, including income, immigration status of the household members, who is considered a roommate, and the newer rules that we have about bedrooms, utilities, and rent reasonableness. So talking about this first rule, needing a cash assistance case with a minor in the home. So in the household, there needs to be at least one person in receipt of cash assistance who is either pregnant and has immigration status, or is the parent, guardian, or caretaker relative of a minor child, or a minor child under the age of 18 years old or under 19 and attending high school or its full-time equivalent. So that last rule is a little tricky. If you have a family that has older kids, you want to pay attention to the fact that in order to be considered a minor for the purposes of public assistance, the child needs to either be under 18, or under 19, meaning that they're 18 and they're still attending high school or its full-time equivalent. They're getting a GED or some other, I don't know if there are other equivalents actually off the top of my head, but that they're attending high school or its full-time equivalent. So you need to have a cash assistance case and one of those kind of minor children scenarios. The cash assistance case, when you submit the application, the cash assistance case needs to be completely open for any family members who are required by law to be on the budget. And there can be no sanctions at the time of the application. Sanctions are, again, this is something you might want to talk a little bit more about next week, but a sanction is some sort of decision by HRA that says that the family has, not complied with the program in some sense, and they're not getting their full benefits as a result of this alleged lack of compliance. Sanctions for our purposes can be related to work, but it can also include child support sanctions, which would reduce a household's cash assistance budget by 25%. They have restarted since the pandemic, effective June 2022. So people are being sanctioned for child support sanctions. Work sanctions, meaning somebody in the household who is eligible for cash assistance and is also supposed to be participating in an HRA related work program. Those can cause a pro rata reduction on the cash case, on the cash assistance case and the subsidy. So they would reduce the cash amount that the family is getting by that person's share. For example, if there are 4 people in the household and one person has a work sanction, the benefits are going to be reduced by 1/4. They haven't really been applying work sanctions during the pandemic, but it seems like at any point those could restart. They may have, we're sort of all at the mercy of HRA and when they decide to start implementing those again. But at this point, those are not something you need to look for, but you do need to be looking for child support sanctions. If either of those sanctions are on the case, the the case will not be processed for FEPS. A FEPS application cannot be processed by the agency. So this is a little review. When is there a family of one in receipt of cash assistance? There are a couple of variations. So the first option is that there is a person with a verified pregnancy. Pregnancy can be verified in New York State, right, at 4 months. So once a person has been pregnant for 4 months, at that time, they can get a letter from their OBGYN confirming that they're pregnant. They bring that into HRA. That would be considered, if this woman who is pregnant has open cash assistance case, she's going to be considered a household of one with a minor child, because they're considering the fetus a child from 4 months moving until the baby is born. An NEIS, parent guardian with citizen child. So NEIS stands for not eligible due to immigration, not eligible immigration status. So this, I think there was a question popping up, I saw someplace, and we'll talk about it. Parents who do not have an eligible immigration status, and that could be a whole variety of things, because there are some immigration status that you could still get cash assistance benefits even if you're not a US citizen. But for the purposes of this, the kind of all-encompassing term is that for whatever reason, their immigration status does not make them eligible for cash assistance, but they have US citizen children who are eligible for cash assistance. Those households are eligible for FEPS if the citizen children have a cash assistance case. So in that circumstance, the parent is sort of acting almost as a payee for the child. They get the money, and the case is going to be sort of, they're the head of household, but the benefits are not for them. The benefits are for the children, so they would qualify. Another circumstance where you're going to have a minor child is that either the parent or the child, one or the other, the parent guardian, is getting SSI. If you're getting SSI, which is supplemental security income, it's a federal needs-based benefit, kind of the federal equivalent to cash assistance. You're not eligible to get cash assistance, right? We don't let people get in the US, we don't let people get sort of the federal and the state benefit at the same time. But if one member of the household is getting SSI and the other member, whether it's the child or the parent, is eligible for cash assistance, that's going to be a household that's going to qualify for FEPS, so long as there is a minor child and there's a cash assistance case. It doesn't matter who has the cash assistance case, whether it's the kid or the adult. And then the last circumstance is a grandparent with their own income and a child with cash assistance. So the parent of the child is 18 or older and may not be in the household, may not be on the cash assistance case, but they're not part of it. But the grandparent has income, and the child, sort of similar almost to the NEIS circumstance, the grandparent is like the payee for the child with cash assistance. They're going to qualify. So if there's a person in the home who's supposed to be on the cash assistance case and they're not, or the cash assistance case is still in application, AP status, or SI, which means single issuance status, is HRA going to process the FEPS application? Nope, they're not. And it can be really frustrating for us in the housing context. Like if we are working with clients and we're working against a deadline from the court or a court ordered stipulation, and we can't process the FEPS application because the case hasn't been opened yet, it's still in application status, we can't get that FEPS application in, so we can't submit it. The case has to be in active status. Nobody can have any sanctions, and it needs to show sort of that everybody is being budgeted correctly, and anyone who must be on the case is part of the case, and before they're going to be willing to process it. If you try to submit it, the application is going to be rejected, and you're going to have to do a lot of advocacy to try to get it opened as quickly as possible. It's frustrating. We don't really know why this can't be, if it's going to be in application status, that you could move it forward, but the state, which oversees HRA, the city social services agency says that you're not allowed to have a FEPS application be processed while the case is in application status.
I just want to put a quick reminder that if you do have any questions, there's something that says Q&A. And if you could put your questions in there, it will make it easier for us to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so rule number 2, the family needs to be either facing eviction, facing homelessness or homeless, and or meet the exception. So what does this mean? There are a few ways, right? It's not kind of a straightforward answer what it means to be either facing homelessness or homeless. There are 5 ways plus an additional exception that a family could demonstrate that they're eligible under this prong. So the first way, and kind of the most common in our practice, is that they live in New York City in a residence that is subject to an eviction proceeding. Their landlord has sued them in housing court to get them out of the apartment. That would be considered facing homelessness. Number 2, or letter B, is that there's been a foreclosure action that's been commenced against the tenant's apartment or the building in New York City. So we know that they're going to be ultimately at risk of eviction because the building is being foreclosed upon and the ownership is unclear. The 3 other reasons, which for us are a little less common in our practice, but you all may see them more. But the family is going to be required to leave their residence because there's a health or safety reason that some city third party, city agency, like the district attorney's referral or an ACS referral, they've said you can't stay in this apartment anymore. There's an issue and it's not going to work. Another reason is that the family was evicted from their apartment or they had to leave their residence because it was the subject of an eviction proceeding. So for example, maybe there was an eviction case 6 months ago, they ended up leaving and moving in with a family member, then they're eligible to apply if they can demonstrate that they had to leave their apartment because of the eviction proceeding, because they were either evicted or they left their apartment. And the last way is that they're currently in a shelter, a DHS or an HRA shelter, and they were evicted within the last 12 months, and they need to find a new apartment. Kind of touching back to the earlier slide in terms of FEPS B, families who are homeless or in danger of homelessness due to domestic violence or intimate partner violence would be eligible for FEPS B as opposed to FEPS A. In addition to all 5 of those ways to demonstrate that you're facing homelessness, you can also, right now, the city is currently making an exception for individuals who are served with what is called a rent demand, which is the notice that a landlord provides to their tenants when they anticipate suing them for non-payment of rent. And that's an exception. And this might be on the next slide, I think, and then I'll touch on the questions. So there is this special policy bulletin that HRA released. It's in effect until at least the end of this calendar year, that for people who are living in New York City, they got a written rent demand that's threatening to sue them in a non-payment case, which is something to be mindful of. They're being sued because their landlord's alleging that they haven't paid their rent, and that they've submitted a financial hardship declaration that HRA will give them. HRA is letting those applications move forward. That's a pretty great thing because it sort of saves people the headache of having to be sued in housing court. If somebody comes in and they show you a rent demand and the rent demand indicates that their landlord says they owe this money and they need to pay it by a certain date, and if they don't, they're going to sue them in housing court. If they have an open cash assistance case and they have a minor child and they meet these other requirements, they're going to be eligible to be able to apply for FEPS at that time. So that's something to keep your eyes peeled for. I want to just take a look at the questions before I move on. So Elon, I'm looking at your question. Do you qualify for City FEPS A if you have a history of domestic violence and mental illness? So City FEPS and FEPS are two different programs. And I think there may be already an existing training for City FEPS. I'm just to the extent that you're curious about that and you want to talk about it, I would consider checking that out. So FEPS A, though, for the program that we're talking about today, having a history of domestic violence and mental illness is not a necessary prerequisite to qualify for FEPS A. Those might be, factors that you would want to highlight to them in hopes of sort of moving the application forward, but it's not a requirement for the program. FEPS B, which we mentioned at the beginning, and I think you'll all see when you get the slides later. FEPS B is a program that's specifically set up to assist families who are in need of a new residence or in need of an additional subsidy in their current residence because of a history of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So those are kind of two separate programs. But the program that we're really talking about today, FEPS A, that's not a prerequisite. Hopefully that answered your question, Noan, but feel free to, if you have additional questions, to pull that up. Victor, the difference between FEPS and City FEPS is sort of not that important for our purposes right in this moment, but it is good to distinguish it because there are really a lot of differences in the programs. And I would, again, recommend checking out the City FEPS training that was previously held. But the difference really sort of at their core is that one is administered by the city and comes from city funding, and the other one is administered by the city and the state and is supported by the state. So FEPS is a state kind of sponsored program. City FEPS is a purely New York City sponsored program. And City FEPS is in a lot of ways like a better program, I would argue, only because there's more money right now that people are eligible for. But again, I would suggest to get into the sort of details of that, to check out the trainings. And I guess better is probably, FEPS is a great program for a lot of reasons. Right now, the money that City FEPS is able to pay is a little bit higher than what FEPS can pay. I think Isa too also has an additional thing she wanted to just chime in on this question, maybe. No.
Sorry, no, I was just marking that you answered it
Oh,
live.
cool. Okay. All right. So I think maybe I can check. So Ludmila, I might suggest, just because your question is getting into the kind of specifics of your client's situation, to maybe come to the Ask a Lawyer section next week, or you could try to email us separately, but it just because I don't think, it'll be too complicated to kind of get into the details of your client's case in this minute. I apologize about that. So rule number 3, the family needs to have a 1-year lease to stay at the time of the approval if the apartment is not rent regulated. So without getting too deep into the weeds of the housing law in New York City, as you know, I'm not from New York originally, but I think as soon as you live here, and especially if you're a renter, you come to learn quickly that we have sort of 2 stocks of apartments in New York, generally speaking. Market rate apartments, which are not subject to any kind of rent regulation, and rent regulated apartments, which can include rent control and rent stabilized apartments. And those rent regulated apartments have specific increases and other protections to tenants, including the right to a renewal lease, which is why having a rent regulated apartment meets this requirement. You're able to get a renewal lease. So there's kind of a guarantee that you're going to be in this apartment for 1 year. So if you're in a market rate apartment, you need to have a lease that is good for 1 year from the time of the approval, or you need to be a rent regulated tenant who has the right to a renewal lease by virtue of the nature of your apartment. If the applicant is not the tenant of record, there are some additional things. So for example, this is a circumstance where if you have a case that, let's say, the primary tenant, the tenant of record, isn't eligible for cash assistance and doesn't have a cash assistance case, and maybe doesn't, for whatever reason, isn't going to be eligible for FEPS because they don't meet the other requirements, but they have a a roommate, somebody else who lives in the apartment, who does have a minor child and has a cash assistance case, then we're going to need to look at these options. So the tenant of record needs to have income at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. And the tenant of record needs to have a lease or residency rights for at least 12 months at the time of the approval. And then the last thing is that the tenant of record is going to need to give the applicant, the sort of roommate or other person, permission to be in the apartment for 1 year in order for that whole household to qualify for FEPS. So in my practice, for example, to help illustrate this a little bit better, I was working with a family. It was a grandfather, his daughter, and her daughter, or the granddaughter. And the daughter and granddaughter were eligible for a cash assistance case. The grandfather was not eligible for cash assistance because he didn't have immigration status that made him eligible. And so the cash assistance case needed to go through the daughter and the granddaughter. But the grandfather was the tenant of record. So in this case, we needed to demonstrate that even though the tenant of record, the grandfather, was not going to be on the cash assistance case, that he had a lease that put him in the apartment for 12 months at the time of the approval, that his income was at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, and he needed to complete an agreement and provide a letter sort of confirming that the daughter and the granddaughter lived with him and had permission to live with him for the next year. So we needed to show all three of those things in order for the case to be approved. The other alternatives is that you can also have the co-applicant be added to the lease. Sometimes that can be, a little more complicated, but it's absolutely possible. Or you could put them in a court stipulation. And this is crucial. The arrears period needs to match the co-tenancy period. So in my circumstance, the period of time that we were seeking arrears for, we needed to show that the daughter and granddaughter had been living in that apartment during that entire time, even though there were, to make sure that they could qualify for the back rent for the entire period. So rule number 4, everyone in the residence who's eligible for cash assistance must get cash assistance or have a very verified income. The one sort of exception to that is a person who's not eligible due to their immigration status, who doesn't have any income, isn't going to have a share of the rent, and they're going to be invisible to the head count. So basically the rule is, unless you are not eligible to work because of immigration status, you essentially need to either be on the cash assistance case or have some other income that you can make a contribution towards the share. And they're going to be really adamant about that. If there's, if you don't have any income and there's no other sort of bind in terms of your getting income, then you need to get on the cash assistance case. So any person who's living in the apartment who's over 18 and has a share is going to need to complete the roommate form. And this can mean even if, for example, I had a household, again, where it was multi-generational. So we have a grandmother, her daughter, and the grandchildren all living in the household. The grandmother had her own cash assistance case, which was fine to do because she doesn't have any legal obligation to be on anybody else's cash assistance case. The daughter had a cash assistance case with her children. And so the grandmother needed to fill out a roommate form confirming that her share was going to be paid by her cash assistance case. She was going to contribute her share that way. If she had been employed, it would have been the same way. She would need to fill out this form. So even in the terms of a relative, somebody who is not in receipt of cash assistance or not on this cash assistance case and has their own share is going to need to complete this form. This would include even if it's a child who has Social Security. So we don't usually think of a child who's, under 18, but they as a roommate, but if they do have their own income, for example, they're getting SSI, they would need to complete a roommate form and confirm what their share is going to be in order to qualify. So everybody basically is going to have to contribute a share, with the small exception that if you're not eligible due to immigration status and you don't have any income, then you will not have to contribute a share and you will not be considered really part of the household headcount.
And I'll jump in now. My name is Ann Mikeswell. I use she or they pronouns. I also work in the Brooklyn neighborhood office representing tenants who are facing eviction. So great to see so many people. Keep the questions coming. They've been great so far. And I'm going to pick up with rule number 5 of those top 7 rules that we mentioned at the beginning we would go through. So this rule, I'll tell you the typical in normal times, and then the special rule just for this moment during the pandemic. Normally, the applicant must owe no more than $9,000 in order to get those arrears paid by FEPS. So we see these cases a lot where people are being evicted because they owe $6,000, $8,000. After the pandemic, often even more. And in normal times, up to $9,000, FEPS is able to pay that amount of back rent, in addition to setting you up to pay FEPS going forward once you qualify. Temporarily, this is very exciting for many of us, that until the end of this year, the end of December 2022, the amount is increased to $20,000. And so I'm sure a lot of you see this in your work as well. People have had such a hard time paying rent during the pandemic that these numbers have just became so much higher than usual. And so for the moment, that limit has been increased, which is a great thing for a lot of our clients. So those are the regular caps, but I'll also say that, and this is going back to regular times, the state may allow HRA to pay more on top of that $9,000 amount, usually between $1,000 to $3,000 with extenuating circumstances. And we'll talk more about that as well. For extreme cases, it can go up to $14,000. And I'll just mention that home-based money cannot be used in combination for a new FEPS application. One other point to keep in mind here is that the advocate who's submitting the application, if you put it in, whenever you put it in, that cap is held there. So if you're coming right up to $9,000 or up to currently $20,000, it's great to go ahead and put that application in, even if, for example, you're fixing some of the details on the cash assistance application. It'll hold your place there. And so if another couple of months pass and you're completing the application, then they will still consider your number to be below the cap that it was when you sent in the application. Isich, do you want to go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So a little bit more about the exceptional circumstances. One thing I'll note is that documentation is key. You'll need to be able to show whatever the circumstances are. Some examples, moving a disabled person from the apartment, if that would create a substantial hardship. Maybe you live near a doctor or somebody you get treatment from. Maybe the apartment is on the first floor. Maybe the child has an IEP that is specific to being able to stay in this apartment is especially helpful, those types of situations. And in each of those, you could show documentation for. More examples, if the family has a long-standing tie to the community, if the neighbors babysit, language ties to the neighborhood, the daycare is close by. Having a very large household can also qualify. Somebody is pregnant, or there's 2 or more very young children. And also contributions from the community in terms of charity can show as well that you have community connections. That should be taken into account. Next rule number 6 is that FEPS is a last resort. And so this basically means that if somebody has some other way they would be able to pay rent, then they cannot qualify for FEPS. Roommates, as Emily touched on a bit, will also pay their share of the arrears. So if it's somebody not in the cash assistance household, they will still, if 1 out of 4 people is separated out that way, they will have to pay their share. The people who are applying cannot just get the whole amount covered, even if there's somebody who would be able to pay their own share. The family must use their $2,000 resource maximum if they have funds in the bank. So if somebody has money they have been putting away, unfortunately, or tax return refunds is something that happens seasonally. We see a lot that if people haven't sent in their taxes yet and they're expecting to get a few $1,000s, HRA will ask, do you have a few $1,000s coming? You'll have to put that toward the total before we'll pay the rest. And January 31st to May is the season when HRA will be asking about that. Another warning on this is that it's really important to determine when talking with a client exactly whether they have savings, maybe in a different account, beyond just their regular checking account, if they have multiple bank accounts, if they have a commission from work or a tax refund coming. HRA can trace all of these things by computer these days. And so sometimes clients don't realize that and often just, forget it's the account that was put aside that they don't think about every day. And so just really making sure to jog people's memory that all of that HRA will find it and they'll ask the client to put that money toward. One thing to keep in mind is, we see this during tax season, if somebody had utility bills backed up or child support orders or paying rent that they were using that tax refund for, then that is fine as well. Keep receipts. If folks have a debit card, it can be very easy to show that way. So, HRA just wants it to be accounted for, basically. And then there was a question earlier in the chat about this. What is the maximum rent that is allowed on the FEPS program? There's a lot of factors that go into it. This is one of those issues that I'll tell you some of the basics, and we might go in more into if people have detailed questions during the future training that was mentioned. But some aspects that will go into it are how many people in the family receive cash assistance, who else is in the home, not on the cash assistance household, do they count toward the maximum rent? Is the family staying versus moving? Are they moving to from a different apartment versus from shelter? And other aspects of the old rent, such as is a preferential, regulated, what kind of lease was it? One more factor was the client receiving a rent subsidy before. And just a note that many of these old programs, FEPS without the H link to city FEPS, converted to the new FEPS in 2017. We also mentioned this before. Ideally, you want the client to be able to stay for more than a year in the apartment. And so that comes into play here as well. A note that is new, I believe in February this past year, the FEPS subsidies will be reset every year now in January based on NYCHA Section 8 standard. So that's between 90 and 110% of the HUD fair market rent. And so it's currently at 108% of the fair market rent in September 2021. I'll get into the rent levels in the next slide though. So just for quick reference, and then we'll skid right past this one. This is what it was previously up until this past February, but you'll see it's going to be the same theme. The main factor, of course, all these others are taken into account, is the family size and the bedroom size. And so this is, we're now on the slide for how the rents are set currently. And there's a few more details I'll get into after this, which is how utilities factor in and rent reasonableness factor in. But these are the basic levels. And the main thing to look at is the family size on the left side. You'll see basically for every 2 people, you get an additional bedroom. So if there's 1 person in the family, you could get a studio or 1 bedroom. If there's 4 people, you could get 2 bedrooms, 5 people get 3. And so you'll see based on the number of bedrooms on the right side, and then the second to the right side is what the maximum FEPS rent is. So we often talk about 3 or 4 people in a 2-bedroom, and the maximum rent, with a couple of caveats I'll get into next, would be $2,217. So when shopping for a new apartment, if somebody is getting FEPS to move and they're approved by City DSS via home base, they're given a shopping letter based on those factors we just looked at, the household countable members and the bedroom size. So the example I was just talking about, if the household is approved for a 2-bedroom, because there's 3 to 4 countable people, And they find a 3-bedroom though, that's at that cost. So, you've got 4 people, and so you qualify for 2 bedrooms. And so $22.17 would be your rent. Say you're able to find a 3-bedroom at under $22.17, that's okay. However, if you find an apartment for $22.20, just a little bit over, unfortunately, the household cannot make up that difference on the side. So I mentioned those are the baselines. I'll keep talking about the 2217 is subject to a few other factors. One of them is that the FEPS program now looks at which utilities are included. So you'll see for a 2-bedroom, that 2217 number again is when all utilities are included in that rent. But for example, if cooking gas and electric, that's true in my apartment, if that's true for the apartment that somebody's moving into, that number is actually a little bit lower that they can get for the rent, because it's assuming that they will need to pay those utilities out of that total amount. And you'll see the same for, depending on the number of bedrooms, it's decreased accordingly. And you'll see broken out each of the amounts based on exactly which utilities are included. So if you're working with somebody who has one of those shopping letters, that's one of the important pieces of information to find out in determining whether the rent is at an acceptable level. So we've talked about some of this. They're most common where the tenant pays for their own cooking, gas, and utility. Unlike Section 8, though, the tenant does not get a credit to offset their share of the rent. We also mentioned, so if, for example, we talked about a little bit the opposite direction, but if a family lives in a smaller apartment than their family size, so if at 5 or 6, you would qualify for a 3-bedroom, but you're in a 2-bedroom, you actually end up using that slightly bigger utility amount. We can get into more details about that, but that's the basics on that. And so here's the third major piece. So we're looking at bedrooms, we're looking at number of family members, we're looking at utilities. And then the last piece to take into account is that rents are now subject to rent reasonableness. And so what this means is that the rent cannot exceed other rents roughly that are charged for comparable units in the same neighborhood. City DSS has contracted with the same vendor as NYCHA. The vendor has a computer program that has tens of thousands of units. And so basically they're able to average what, a 2-bedroom in East Flatbush might cost. And so HRA is still training staff. We're still finding a little bit more about this all the time, about how exactly this plays out. But basically what may happen is that the idea is, so we've talked about kind of the maximum rent, which will be decreased a little bit if utilities are not included. And even at that level, if you live in a neighborhood where the going rents are much lower than that, then you may have an even lower cap. And so rent reasonableness is something that you'll need to take into account in neighborhoods that often have lower rents, in the Rockaways or East New York, in Brooklyn, where I work. But so that's anyway, so that'll set a little bit of a lower cap, but this is important for advocates who may be in court at the time, because often there will be a settlement with the landlord about how much time you have to pay and what exactly the rent would be. And so you will need to ensure that whatever that rent is going to qualify under rent reasonableness ahead of time before you finish settling the case. Another few tips on rent reasonableness: if there are more accountable people than the maximum size, then that makes it more likely to qualify. So if you have 6 accountable people, but it's only a 2-bedroom, that will weigh in your favor. I also mentioned that in lower rent zip codes, that's where the rents are lower, and so that amount may cut off where you can get FEPS for. But in higher rent zip codes, you are less likely to have this problem as well. One other aspect of this, so we've talked about if you have, for example, 3 or 4 people, you would qualify for a 2-bedroom. But one important thing to keep in mind is that for families who have a member with a disability that would require their own room, then that can be a reason to bump you up to the next level. So for example, if somebody has a need for a hospital bed and medical equipment, or someone who might have a developmental disability or some kind of mental health diagnosis that would require quiet and privacy, if you can document that, it's again kind of all about the doctor's note. Then, if you've got a family of 4 that would qualify for a 2-bedroom, but one of those people needs their own bedroom, then you could be bumped up to a 3-bedroom level. And that's it for, oh, I'm sorry, there is a little bit more. So we've been talking a lot about FEPS to stay, but for FEPS to move, the incentives have shifted as well, and they change between the different types of programs. So this chart shows basically moving out of a shelter versus moving from one apartment to another, and you'll see the breakdown here. In both cases, when you sign the lease, the first month is paid in full along with the next 3 months of subsidy. There is no signing bonus in either case. Move within the community would not qualify for a hold on the rent. A move from shelter would. What that basically is if you identify the apartment and there's an agreement that you'll be taking it, but for some reason you can't move until the following month, HRA is able to pay an incentive equal to 1 month's rent in order for them to hold it for you. And there's also a difference in the amount of broker's fee that you can get. Coming from shelter, you can get up to 15%, and moving within the community, you can only get up to half of a month of broker's fee. One last item. So we keep talking about the 2217 level. Say that you are, the typical or the example family I keep talking about, 3 or 4 people, and you would qualify for the 2217 rent. If the rent for the apartment is $2,217.01, unfortunately, you cannot get FEPS for that apartment. So that's in the year that you get the subsidy that comes into play. In the last couple of years, we've seen at least one time for rent stabilized apartments, there's been this system where your rents may increase halfway through the year. And if that would get you over the amount, then that may be fine. And if it increases mid-year, then the tenant would pay the difference. And we believe that in year 2, the rent can go above that maximum, but that it would be on the tenant to pay the difference, so long as the cash assistance case does not close or decrease or fall off the budget.
So now I'm going to go over some of the minor rules. These are things to continue to keep in consideration when you are helping someone apply or figure out if they should apply to FEPS. All right, so the first minor rule is that roommates have to pay a share. So the traditional definition of roommates is not necessarily the same as the HRA definition of roommate. So a roommate can be someone who you're related to, or the client is related to. It's basically any adult who's not a part of the mandatory filing unit. They have to pay their share of the rent and their arrears if they have immigration status, right? So their share of the rent is going to be 30% of their gross income or their pro rata share, which is like their piece. For example, as Emily said before, if there are 4 people in a household, the pro rata share of one person is going to be 1/4, 25%, whichever one is lower. So in that case, the 25% would be lower. So the roommate would be required to pay that 25%. We're going to train more on this later. The second minor rule that we have is about processing FEPS applications in the pandemic. So a lot of you had questions about this in the Q&A. If you figure out that your client is eligible for FEPS, or you're pretty sure that your client is eligible for FEPS, right? So most legal services providers are trained by us at the Legal Aid Society and are approved by HRA to submit applications to the FCDU, which is the FEPS Centralized Determination Unit, by email. Before, there were community-based organizations to submit JIGIT FEPS without an H and the former FEPS application. Those contracts ended on December 31st, 2019. So before, home base used to be able to process FEPS to stay applications. However, now home bases in the New York City area can only process FEPS to move applications and city FEPS. So FEPS to stay applications are now processed by the Homelessness Diversion Unit, HDU, which is under the umbrella of HRA and the legal service providers, right? So unfortunately, the Access HRA that many of our clients who have public assistance use to review their benefits has no way of notifying HRA that the person is trying to apply for FEPS. So we always 1000% support using a legal service provider to do the application. But if your client is trying to apply for FEPS using Access HRA, they can apply for a one-shot deal and then in the notes section say that they are actually applying for FEPS. That is the only way that the Homelessness Diversion Unit will know that someone is submitting a FEPS application. Also, in that process, Access HRA has difficulties with documents sometimes being submitted virtually. So it's very, very important that you use a legal service provider whenever you can to submit a FEPS application, because we can just send them in one shot in an email, and you don't have to worry about missing documents or not getting approved because of missing communication. The third minor rule is that the FEPS program as it currently exists started December B of 2017. So what December B means is when someone is on cash assistance, they receive two checks. They receive the A check and the B check. The A check is more in the beginning of the month, or usually around the 1st through the 7th. And then the B check is more around the 15th. So FEPS started on the second half of December. Then, since February 16th, 2022, the state and the city have agreed to increase the FEPS amounts. So while we do have the increased FEPS amounts, if you do have a client who's had FEPS before February 16, 2022, it's important to know what their amounts were. So those old charts are helpful in doing the math and trying to figure out how much is owed, arrears, things like that. So now FEPS levels are the same as Section 8 levels. Recently, City FEPS has raised their levels. FEPS has not done so yet, but we expect that to be happening pretty soon. We are asking for them to do it as soon as possible. We've been asking them to do it as soon as possible. But if you do have a client who meets the city FEPS levels, but does not meet the FEPS levels, feel free to reach out to Legal Aid Society. You can get to us through 311. We run the Housing Advocates line there. So the centers might increase the FEPS at the recertification point, but we're seeing modifications and restorations. Modifications is when a client's rent has increased, they go to the job center, tell the job center that their rent has increased, show them the new lease or new documentation of that. Sometimes HRA job centers aren't processing those correctly, and restorations occur when a household is mistakenly removed from FEPS or correctly removed from FEPS because maybe they no longer qualify for cash assistance. There's also been issues with restoring people onto FEPS. So definitely reach out to a legal provider to fix those things, because we can usually get that process done a little bit more quickly. So the fourth minor rule is that a lease is required for an apartment or residence where there is no rent regulation. So what rent regulation looks like is a rent controlled apartment, a rent stabilized apartment, a Mitchell-Lama apartment, right? So those are apartments that have some types of rules attached to them. But if it does not have a rules attached to it, it is unregulated. And a 1-year lease is required to obtain FEPS and to get that lease increase. And now the information about bedrooms, utilities, and rent reasonableness apply as well. So the fifth minor rule that we have is that rent regulated leases do not have to be a year long. Like I said before, rent regulated includes rent controlled, rent stabilized, Mitchell-Lama leases. Those leases don't have to be a year long because there's an automatic right to getting those apartments renewed for the tenants. So the HRA knows that that is the law, and so they don't need proof that the household can stay there for at least 1 year. But they still have to be within the FEPS levels for bedrooms, utilities, and rent reasonableness. So the sixth minor rule is about FEPS modifications and reporting changes. Any change in the family income or size or any change in the rent amount should be reported to Access HRA or a job center within 10 calendar days, right? That is the rule. However, if that happens and it doesn't happen within the 10 calendar days, the tenants should just do it as soon as possible. If there is a if there's a FEPS subsidy already on the case, any type of modification, any type of change should be filed within 3 months of the change with the FEPS unit, and that's usually done through the job center. So the changes that you want to the FEPS subsidy can only be processed by the homelessness diversion unit or a legal service provider. So for example, sometimes we will reach out to FCDU in order to let them know of some sort of change. If that change isn't reported in a timely manner within the 3 months, there is a possibility that arrears would be provided, but there would be a recoupment on the cash assistance case, which means that the cash that the household is getting would be just a little bit less because it's being paid back. So during the pandemic, this was really a problem. But honestly, if you do have an issue with modification, restoration, I would definitely suggest just reaching out to a legal service provider because I think the homelessness diversion unit is still figuring out how they want to process these things on their own. For example, we have a client named Connie who received a rent increase in December. They have a rent stabilized lease renewal. Connie's new rent is well below the maximum, so we're good on that, and fits the family size for the FEPS limits, so we're good on that. When must Connie report this change to HRA, right? So the increase happened in December, right? And as we know, it's 3 months. Connie has to report the change within 3 months. So as the next slide shows us, December is month 1, January is month 2, and February is month 3. Now, this is all assuming that the change did not affect the cash assistance case being open. If the change is reported in April, the arrears will only be issued for April, March, and February. And the arrears that I'm talking about is the difference between the old rent and the new rent. Usually that's small enough for tenants to cover, but some tenants have such a fixed income that would just be too much. So the next question is, who pays the January increase? So in that case, the client will pay the January increase. The tenant will pay the January increase. Sometimes you can reach out to a charity if that amount is too much. So the next rule is about FEPS restorations. If a cash assistance case is closed, most cash assistance case close because the family becomes over income, right? So that's the normal reason why we see cash assistance case close. Sometimes it's because they did not recertify, but I think HRA is doing a better job with sending out the recertification notices. But if a cash assistance case closes, the FEPS will stop because the FEPS is directly tied to the cash assistance case. But if the cash assistance case is reopened, for example, if someone reapplies because they've then lost their income, or if someone was mistakenly removed because they never got their recertification notice, they then apply again and their cash assistance case is reopened on a brand new case, the FEPS restoration will not happen automatically. The client has to reapply for FEPS, uh, and in that reapplication, mark that it's a FEPS restoration, right? And they have to give a breakdown from the landlord in order to show what rent was missing when the case closed. This can happen within 1 year of a cash assistance case closing. There is no lawsuit needed for this to happen. During the pandemic, it's ideal for us as advocates to do this for our clients, right? So after the pandemic, the homeless diversion unit is able to do this, but usually what happens in this case is our clients will receive a phone call and I will tell my client, okay, please make sure you take down the name, phone number, or email of the person who contacted you. So then I can be the point person and my client doesn't have to worry about answering questions when I know the rules about a FEPS restoration. So we are seeing process issues with the homeless diversion unit. This is really the opportunity for us to advocate and step in to do that. So the eighth minor rule that we have is when you're restoring the FEPS case, right? That can be within 1 year and sometimes within many years. If you have arrears during any months that the FEPS was on the budget, right? That can be recoupable. So sometimes a household is eligible for FEPS, but they still have a rent share because someone in the household is working. That rent share is the responsibility of the household to pay. For example, some families might have a rent share of $100 to $150. If it's a case where the family was not paying their $100 to $150 during the time the cash assistance was closed, it's still the family's responsibility to get that $100 or $150 a month. So they could ask for it from HRA, but if they were to ask for that amount from HRA, that amount is recoupable. So it has to be paid back. It basically, when something is recoupable, that means it's a loan. It's not a grant. It's not a gift to the household. Because it's a loan, it's usually paid back through the cash grant, the amount that the household is getting on the card to use as cash. And it's usually charged at 10%. So there is a one recruitment in a FEPS lifetime when there is a restoration or a modification. Of course, there are always exceptions, right? But when the recoupment is small enough, definitely as an advocate, reach out to a charity or see if your client is able to get that money from elsewhere as a gift so that they don't have to worry about that recoupment coming out of their cash assistance case. For example, Beatrice had FEPS from January 2020 to June 2020. Her shelter allowance was budgeted because she had work income, but she never paid her share to the landlord. Her cash assistance case, and therefore her FEPS case, closed from July 2020 to September 2020 because then she had an increase in income. She asked for a FEPS restoration in November of 2020 after her cash assistance case was reopened. She would be recouped for her budgeted shelter share from January 2020 to June 2020 only. So that amount from January 2020 to June 2020 was her responsibility because she had a share. And so because she had a share and she did not pay that share, that amount would be turned into a loan. It would be recoupable. So another rule that we have is that only Homebase can process a move for FEPS or anything for city FEPS, whether it's a move or staying in the community. Some reasons for a move. So this usually, we find this for our clients who are already on FEPS, but might want to move into a bigger space, a smaller space, a safer space, right? So reasons why moves in the community happen can be for health and safety. It can be for a holdover case, which is a specific type of housing case that has nothing to do with the one-time paying of the rent. Or it can be a smaller household size, or it can be even a bigger household size. Only a home base can process these applications. Something important to note about home bases is right now, as y'all probably know, there is a huge need for people to get housing resources in New York City. Therefore, the home base waiting list right now in a lot of the boroughs goes way out. For example, I was talking to a client last week and they have an appointment for October. They were able to get an appointment for October. So if you do have a client who might need to process a move and they know beforehand, the sooner the better for them to just get that ball rolling, because the process can take a really long time. So the last child aging out, right? So HRA will continue to approve a FEPS application if there is at least 90 days left before the youngest child ages out. For example, if the child's birthday is on March 15th, you can, if you submit that application by December 15th, the child should be good because that's 3 months before the child's birthday. At least 90 days left before the youngest child aging out. And then if there are less than 90 days, but at least 30 days, HRA would still find that the household is eligible if they have a plan for showing that the family can afford the rent after FEPS. So FEPS will usually end on or about the last child's birthday, which is 18 or 19 if they are still in high school or a high school equivalent program. So something important to remember about FEPS is that FEPS is a subsidy to cover rent only. It does not cover late fees. It does not cover parking fees. It does not cover legal fees or marshal fees. A lot of things that we'll see in housing court cases is that landlords will include these fees in the breakdown. Tenants who are unrepresented or sometimes even represented will agree to pay the entire amount, but FEPS on their approval will not include these other fees. So these are not fees that are covered in the FEPS approval. The FEPS unit will process marshal and legal fees if the family is out of possession. So if they've been evicted already. So this is a family that has gone through eviction maybe within the last month, and the landlord has agreed to restore the family to possession. That's really the only exception that we'll see for the FEPS unit processing marshal and legal fees, not those other late fees, parking fees. Sometimes we see washing machine fees, things of that sort. So there were also a couple of questions about this. FEPS, individuals who are in unregulated housing, rent stabilized housing, Mishawama housing, Section 236 HUD preservation program, Section 8 sticky voucher, and SCREE or DREE can have FEPS. So, you'll see if you are not sure if your client fits under these circumstances, you can call 311 to double check, but you'll also most likely be able to tell with your client through the paperwork that they have if they fit under any of these categories. So a household cannot have FEPS when they live in NYCHA project apartments, and you cannot add FEPS onto an ACS rent subsidy. We usually see that with individuals who have chosen to have a foster child, right? So that ACS rent subsidy cannot be added onto FEPS, and FEPS cannot be added onto the ACS rent subsidy. So the 12th minor rule that we have is about sanctions reducing the FEPS subsidy. So Emily definitely talked about this earlier. When a family's shelter allowance is reduced due to a sanction, the FEPS subsidy will also be reduced. So if you are seeing that your client isn't getting the full amount of shelter or full amount of cash assistance, that usually means that there's a sanction on the case. And the best way to deal with that sanction is to reach out to the job center directly in order to get that sanction resolved. There are two types of sanctions: a child support sanction, which reduces the budget by 25%, or work sanction, which reduces the budget by the pro rata share, which is the individual out of the whole household. So what we have seen is child support sanctions have continued, but not work sanctions. If you do have a client who has an issue with a sanction, they might know what it is, because they'll know if they had to report child support, but they did not, or if they had to report that they were working and they did not. So there's usually a very clear path to figure out a sanctions issue, but it can reduce the FEPS subsidy, it can have a negative effect on whether or not the rent is being paid. So what happens when a FEPS application is approved? Where do the checks come from? When the application is approved, CRPU, which is the Centralized Rent Processing Unit, will process the FEPS checks in usually 3 to 5 business days and mail them directly to the landlord. So those FEPS checks are usually the amount for the arrears or any other amount that the FEPS unit has agreed to pay for it. Sometimes that can be brokerage fees. The FEPS to move checks are processed by the home base and are usually currently sent to the new landlord. If the CRPU does not issue the amount that's on the FEPS approval, contact them immediately. If they don't put the checks on the budget or send it to the wrong landlord, also contact them immediately. What we will find is that it's sometimes things happen, paperwork, gets lost, but it's important to contact them immediately so that they can cancel the old checks and reissue new ones. In very, very emergency circumstances, we'll also see that they will let you pick up the checks. At least CRPU will let you pick up the checks from their office in Union Square. So if there is a problem with the FEPS checks months later, contact the job center. So if the job center does not reach out to you, try and contact the director or regional director. We find that contacting them will usually get whatever issue we have be processed more quickly. If you call the caseworker, they will usually have the phone number for their supervisor on their voicemail. And then I've usually just worked up the chain with that to try and get in contact with someone or email someone so that I can get that issue resolved. So that is the end of our presentation. What I'm going to do now is stop sharing and so that we can continue to answer questions. I'm not sure, Anne or Emily, were there any questions that you thought were really poignant that we should share with the rest of the group?
Good question. There's no active ones right now, but I'll check the ones that we've answered.
Yeah, I think they were great questions, really thoughtful questions. We know that it can be really frustrating trying to get in touch with people at home base. That was something that I saw come up a lot of times, and trying to get in touch with workers at HRA. It's an imperfect system for sure. And we wish that there was like a better way to kind of streamline that for everybody. there was a question that I was just answering right now about, if you have a client who you believe is eligible for FEPS and cash assistance, but they're, processing an application online through HRA Access, and it gets marked as a one-shot deal or a one-time rent arrears grant, which is really frustrating. And the question, I think it was from Veronica. Yeah, from Veronica. Was how can we let them know that we want them to apply for FEPS? And it's really annoying because there isn't a great place on the application on HRA Access to make that declaration. But what I was just advising Veronica is that I think any way that you can kind of make that known, whether you submit it as a letter with the documents, the supporting documents for the HRA application, like you on behalf of the person that you're working with, sort of write out something and say, we believe the applicant's eligible for ongoing cash assistance and also eligible for FEPS, and we'd like the application to be processed as a FEPS application. That's one way to do it. Letting the individual who's actually applying for cash assistance know, so that when they have their follow-up eligibility interview, they should also say it to the worker at that time. And then if you're able to get contact information for any of the HRA workers, to also shoot them an email and let them know that that's what's happening. So I think it's imperfect, and HRA's obligation is that they should be screening cases for that exact reason. They're supposed to be looking out to confirm that if you're eligible for cash assistance and then eligible for FEPS, your application should be processed that way instead of as a one-shot deal application, because it's a much more long-term helpful benefit. But they don't always do that. So it is kind of up to you and to your client to really follow through and push them on it. If you're having issues, I know, and this sort of dovetails with the second question that I think came up a lot. If you're having issues with this and you really are not able to get in touch with HRA, there are some times that we can intervene a little bit. Legal service providers can intervene a little bit, and so I'd encourage you, as Isa mentioned, to reach out to us through 311 and kind of connect and say, this is a problem. We're having a hard time doing this. We're not a magic bullet by any means, and there's not always a way that we can kind of intervene and help, and obviously have our own kind of caseloads and clients, so sometimes it can be hard to do that. But if you're having a challenge, that might be one way to do it. But it's definitely a frustrating process, and I would just try to let them know as many ways as you can that you want this to be processed as a FEPS application, and keep bugging them.
Yeah, definitely great advice. There are a couple of questions also that have come out. So I'm gonna just answer them out loud. We have a question. Can you apply online with a paper application, or do you have to go into an HRA office? You can request a paper application to be mailed to you, but honestly, HRA's processing of paper applications right now is very, very slow. And we usually find that people who are having issues with pending homelessness don't have the time that it takes for that process to be done through paper. But you can call 311 and request a paper application, but we do not highly recommend it. So next question is, how can a tenant apply for FEPS? They can apply for FEPS normally, if they have a housing case through their legal service provider. They can apply for FEPS through the Access HRA portal, but as Emily said, that process is very difficult. And they just have to mention at every point, every step of the way, that I'm trying to apply for FEPS, because it might process them for a one-shot deal application. That's for FEPS to stay. FEPS to move, they need to go to a home base. So in order to figure out what the best home base for your client is, you can either Google home base, right? And then they have a chart with zip codes that will tell you what the relevant home base is. You can also call 311. Use the city resource, honestly. You can also call 311 and tell them the zip code, and they'll give you the contact information for the home base. Some zip codes have more than one home base, so make sure that they are giving you all of the home bases for the zip code. Then we have, okay, what's the difference between FEPS and city FEPS, right? So FEPS, in addition, the most important requirements that you have to know for FEPS is that the household has a minor and that there is an open cash assistance case. Those are the two most important requirements, not the only ones, but the most important ones. If the household has a minor, someone under the age of 18 or under the age of 19 and in high school or a high school equivalent program, and they have a fully open cash assistance case with no sanctions, right? For city FEPS, you can review the city FEPS training that we've previously done, but I'm just gonna say quickly for city FEPS, it's eligible. People who are eligible for city FEPS are people who have been homeless and have been in a DHS homeless shelter, so a city homeless shelter, people who are veterans, and people who live in rent-controlled housing. So those also people who have a case with Adult Protective Services, APS. So generally, those are the requirements for city FEPS. There are other smaller exceptions, but definitely review the video of our training on city FEPS previously. So Lucia has a client that may be eligible for FEPS. The client went to HRA. They told her she needed to do it online, right? There is no option on Access HRA to do it online. The way that that process looks is that person has to apply for rent arrears. They have to apply for a one-shot deal. And the idea that HRA has is they will pay attention, and every application where there is a minor and someone is applying for arrears, they will screen them for FEPS. That has not been happening as consistently as we would like. So then it kind of becomes the job of our clients to say, hey, just put in every step of the process that you want to apply for FEPS. Write it everywhere, on the phone call, interview, say FEPS, 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 and then you try and get in contact with the caseworker that's working with them. It is not the perfect option. If they do have a housing court case, which hopefully they don't, right? But if they do have a housing court case, their legal advocate should be able to process that FEPS application for them. But unfortunately, right now, FEPS is not really accessible to the people who need it the most. Someone has a open cash assistance case with a minor child working part-time. So if the cash assistance case remains open, then that family qualifies for FEPS. Yeah, so if they qualify for cash assistance, they qualify for FEPS. Unfortunately, the limit for cash assistance for a household of like two is very, very low, abysmally low. So but if their cash is, yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Oh, just to jump in, and we had a back and forth about this. Do you have a recommendation for somebody to find a quick, if they have a specific situation, depending on the number of people or income? HRA doesn't make it so easy. Should they go to Access HRA to see what those exact low income numbers are?
No, I would honestly, because I don't think HRA makes that information easily accessible, I would honestly tell them to call us at 311, and we have the chart available so someone can help you figure out what that might look like, but it's still not certain, unfortunately. Low income, the maximum income for a household of two, I can try and pull up that information now, but it's not high at all. Give me 1 second. But here we go.
I was gonna say I can keep answering questions. If
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
If you want more time to look for the chart. But if you've got it, no worries.
I have got it.
Take it away.
No, it's asking me to log into my,
Oh, got it.
it's doing that
Okay,
thing.
okay.
Perfect
So
timing.
we'll scoot on a little bit really quick. I know we're almost at, we're over 2 minutes over, but I'm just trying to grab these last questions. So Stephanie, I think in terms of paying the recoupment for a rent modification, and I would refer you back to, I think it's minor rule 6, which is like the modifications. If there's a change in the rent amount, I believe the client has the 3 months to let HRA know about that change, and they should, be okay. So if the landlord provides them, with the lease, they should be 1 month before, and they can bring it in, the new lease starts. They're still kind of ahead of the game because the new amount hasn't gone into effect yet. So they should be okay, unless I'm misunderstanding your question there, but you're welcome to clarify if that is the case. Please just let me know. Will HRA still review a client for city FEPS if the client has Section 8 and is in housing court? No, it's unlikely that if they're getting if they have Section 8 and they have a Section 8 voucher, they're not going to be eligible for city FEPS and FEPS. I think sort of the theory is that city FEPS and FEPS are meant to kind of almost extend eligibility for a Section 8 like program to other people who don't qualify for Section 8 or who haven't been able to get a Section 8 voucher because the waiting list is really long and it's a really complicated process. So they're probably not going to review them if they already know that they have Section 8 and they're getting that subsidy. And I think, yes, ICE2 is answering your question, Michelle.
Yep, it's $574.50 a month.
Way too low.
All
well, I think we made it through.
The 3 of you are absolutely remarkable. Thank you so much for doing this and for answering all these questions. I want to share that in the chat. I put a link to a short survey. If you're able to fill that out, we would really appreciate it. Let us know what trainings you need. We'll do our best to make it happen. I'm also putting in a few of our upcoming events. We've been mentioning our Ask a Lawyer session next week on City FEPS and FEPS. We'll only be answering questions pertaining to those programs, but please come in with your questions. If you have any follow-up questions from today, at more specifics, anything really. On August 8th, we have a training on family and matrimonial law, also with legal aid. And then on the 17th, we have an event called Flipping the Script, a teach-in on the intersection of mental health and homelessness. And it's a panel of people of lived experience, sharing how their experiences with homelessness has impacted their interactions with the healthcare system. And this topic will have an emphasis on, this session will have an emphasis on mental health. And so we'll follow up with the training, the slides, any resources mentioned. And yeah, thank you so much for our trainers. We really appreciate it.